welcome back to When Push Comes to Shove. On today's episode, we're very excited to have the gorgeous Catherine here, who is a midwife. Welcome, Catherine. Thank you so much for joining us. And would you like to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey?
Certainly would. Thank you. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me along. So I am Catherine, and I've been a midwife for, will be 15 years this year. I was a latecomer to midwifery. I qualified when I was 40, and the reason I decided to become a midwife was largely as a result of my own birth experiences. My first birth experience when I was 26 years old, I did a lot of research, I did a lot of reading, I had a load of parenting magazines that I'd read and catalogued, and I thought I had done everything I needed to do to prepare for a positive and empowering birth experience. And unfortunately, that's not the way my first birth unfolded. I ended up on a bed strapped to a monitor. I had pethidine, which didn't really agree with me very much. And then it suddenly became very urgent to get my son out. I wasn't feeling any urges to push, and they wanted to use forceps. And my husband said he didn't want them to use forceps because he had an unusual shaped skull, which I didn't know at the time, but I know now that any molding from forceps disappears usually quite quickly. But he felt that he'd been a forceps birth, and this was the reason why he had this unusual shaped skull. So he didn't want them to use forceps. So he had a discussion with the doctor. This is all going on kind of like over my head, and basically they decided that they could probably manage to get the baby out with an episiotomy. So I still remember every cut of that episiotomy, and I can hear it, and I can hear myself saying bitch to the midwife who did it. Yeah, it wasn't a very pleasant experience. I then had a hematoma, which is a big collection of blood under the skin, and I had to go have a general anaesthetic to have that drained, and woke up in the middle of a blood transfusion, alone in a room, and didn't know where I was. There was no one with me. The baby was asleep in the cot next to me. Yeah, I got moved to a postnatal ward eventually. Nobody told me if I could get out of bed or not. I had a catheter in as well. And the next morning, I don't remember doing anything with my baby overnight, but the next morning when my husband arrived about 8 o'clock, I guess, the baby was still in the cot, crying, filthy, with dirty nappy. I was crying. The catheter had leaked everywhere, all over the floor, and all the urine had soaked up into my hospital bags with all my stuff in it, and everything was soaking wet. And yeah, that was my welcome to motherhood, really.
Oh my. Wow. I mean,
too much information, sorry.
No, absolutely not. I think that a lot of what you actually just said is unfortunately relatable.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole traumatic line of events that just kept on going. I mean, I think that there's a lot of women that could watch this and go, well, I had that part and that part. I mean, I had pethidine. It was awful. I didn't like it at all. Left alone a lot in my first, I had a C-section and I was left to it. Wow, bless you. That's a lot of trauma to get over, especially first time mom. Was you aware of the episiotomy and what that meant? Was it spoken to you, or was it more that your husband and the doctor sort of decided that was, do you remember?
I unfortunately, the only thing I remember is conversations that like we had with friends after the event, where my husband made a very big joke about what he said to the doctor. And I won't repeat it on here because it's really unpleasant and I don't need other people to know about that. But that adds to things, you know, because you become sort of like laughed about. And at the time, I didn't really think anything of it. I think it was only sort of later on that things like that started to affect me, really. We are now divorced, but yeah, that was that. So when I had my second baby, I kind of knew that things couldn't be anywhere near as bad, because the things that had happened to me were very very unusual. So like the hematoma, that's a really unusual thing to happen. The stitches that I'd had, what happened was the hematoma had developed while I was being sutured. So I'd been sutured once, then I had to be unsutured and resutured again. So I had a lot of trouble afterwards with that side of things as well. And yeah, I've never been the same again since. But that's just how things are, unfortunately. And short of having more surgery to repair things, which I don't think I'd bother doing at this stage in my life, there wasn't a lot I could do about that. But my second birth was very, very different, and I had my community midwife who I knew with me, and I just roared my baby out, and I was upright, I was standing, I just had gas and air, and they kept rushing in saying, is everything okay, because I was making so much racket. I was still left alone a lot of the time, but that was because the community midwife was running between 2 rooms, because she had another one of her known patients in the room opposite. So I beat that lady to it. So so that was just, and come home, and I had a small 2nd degree tear the second time around, but the midwife said it didn't need suturing unless I really wanted it to be sutured. And I think at the time it was kind of evidence-based that you could leave, it was as good to leave these things. And for me, it was just life-changing. I went home and I could kick my leg in the air, and I could sit down and I could walk, and I didn't do that new mum just been stitched shuffle. So yeah, that was amazing. And then my third birth was different again. It was sadly very uninspiring, and just kind of it just sort of happened kind of despite me, really, in a very strange way. It was quite uneventful, no trauma or anything, but and I can remember bits of it, but it wasn't as awesome as my second birth was. So yeah, so that was nice. So sorry, I was talking about my journey to where I got to, and I got lost.
No, that's sorry. Wonderful. I think it's really interesting that you said that your third birth was uninspiring. Is that because everything just sort of happened naturally, and just that it was sort of like a almost quick and just done?
It wasn't quick. It was my longest labour, in fact. And I got to the hospital. I'd been waking up every morning for a week, kind of around 2 or 3 or 4 a.m. every morning, and having contractions or practice contractions. And I'd got up and I would be, walking around, doing the ironing, all the things you do when you've got a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old and mountains of jobs to do. And then by 6 a.m. when my children woke up, the babies woke up, everything would go off. And this happened for about a week. So I was completely exhausted. So when the thing started going, I went in, and I think got a recollection that I was about 3 centimeters, and they said, oh, we can break your waters and you can stay and have the baby, kind of thing. So that's what happened. So it was just kind of like a waiting game. And I think I sat on the bed most of the time. I wasn't mobile. Excuse me. And then there was a midwife and a student midwife just sort of sitting in the side of the room, making notes and watching me. And yeah, she was born in the afternoon, which was but yeah, I think that was about 10-hour labour, I think, if I remember rightly. Yeah, whereas my first had been about 9 and the second about 5. Yeah, but yeah, no, that was lovely. And then I was very lucky to be a stay-at-home mum for quite some time, for about 10 years. And then I was getting divorced, and I needed to find a way to support myself and support my children. And I thought about, I'd done some auxiliary nursing some years before with a thought about going into nursing, but I'd realised that that wasn't really for me. And after quite unpleasant experiences on some of the care of the elderly wards. So I had a couple of friends who were midwives actually, and I really, really admired them and the work that they did. And I had so much admiration for my community midwife, the one that had been at my second birth. I just knew what a difference, you know, that relationship-based care could make. And that had been the difference for me in that birth, really, is the fact that I knew her, she knew me, she knew what I'd been through before. And she knew how important certain things were to me, you know. So it was, you know, it was really quite magical to have that birth be, you know, be so much better and so different. And so that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to come into midwifery so that I could help make that difference to women and be that kind of, that known face, that community midwife. That was my aspiration, was to be a community midwife and work in that way, the way that, but unfortunately, once I qualified, things had changed quite a lot, and the way that the community midwifery service was set up was quite different. And you didn't necessarily get to see the same women every week or every couple of weeks, and they didn't get to see you. So we started to lose some of that, what we had then, which was kind of, may have been accidental, but it was continuity of carer nonetheless, you know. But I think then the NICE guidelines changed. They changed the number of visits. You know, I was seeing my midwife very frequently then, sort of once a month up to about 36 weeks, I think, and then every week. And, you know, so there was far more visits.
Time, doesn't it, to really get to know each other and get comfortable and understand where you're coming from. And
absolutely,
it's quite detrimental to birthing people to lose that continuity of care.
It's hugely detrimental, but especially when you think about how birth has been moved out of our communities as well and into hospitals. You know, it's not that many years ago when birth was very much focused in community. You know, you look at the sort of the latter episodes of Call the Midwife, and, you know, some of it looks very archaic, but actually some of it is really nice, because again, they knew the women they're looking after, they knew the community, and the community knew them. I digress again anyway.
Great, we love it.
I did my direct entry midwifery training in 2003 at Anglia Ruskin University, and I started working at Southend Hospital, which was my local hospital. And then I did various different roles there, and ultimately culminated in being practice development midwife there. And then I moved and went to work in a different hospital. I went to work at Queen's in Romford, and I worked there as a midwifery facilitator. So I was due to be going there to work with groups of international midwives who were coming over to help them get used to UK practice. But unfortunately, what happened was, after I arrived there, they didn't have any more groups of European midwives coming through. So I continued obviously working there, but I ended up working as in the education team, partly as education team lead and other roles. And then I only had a temporary contract there because it was funded by NHS London initially, the contract I had there. And I needed to remortgage my house, and I thought I needed a permanent contract at the time. I probably didn't, now I know, but so I took a job as birth centre manager, and this was a brand new birth centre that was opening in January 2013, I think it was. And it was absolutely fantastic. We had a hand-picked team of midwives who were really passionate about normal birth. We had a beautiful, brand new, freshly refurbished home from home birth centre. There were some things that were a little bit disappointing, I suppose, in that initially we weren't going to have like delivery beds, but we ended up having just the same kind of delivery beds as they have on the labour ward. We did have some birthing couches. We had beautiful birth pools, birth stools, and we also had some of that amazing German equipment. I don't know if you know, with the hanging ropes, and the name escapes me, I'm afraid. So yeah, we opened there in January 2013, and it just went from strength to strength. We had a fabulous team working there. we did all our drills and skills, and you know, it got a fantastic reputation as a wonderful place to be, and the, you know, the care we gave was lovely. It was really nice. And then it got a lot busier, and you know, lots of things changed. And in the meantime, I'd done a master's degree in midwifery and women's health, and with the goal of the aim of becoming a consultant midwife. So I went to work for an organisation called One-to-One Midwives. You may have heard of them. They used to work predominantly in the northeast of England, up in Liverpool and on the Wirral, and but they also had an operation in the southeast of England, in northeast Essex, and I'm based in Essex. And so I went to work for them as a consultant midwife, and I was there for about a year. And they were fully case loading midwifery service. So, but they were funded through the NHS. So the women had they had a, you know, their own personal named one-to-one midwife. And it was an absolutely fantastic service. They had 4 to 6 weeks postnatal care.
Wow.
And that would involve, you know, a minimum of sort of 4, 5, 6 visits postnatally. And nearly all their antenatal care was done in their homes, at times to suit them. And the midwives organised their own diaries. And it was wonderful. It was really wonderful, but there was a lot of problems, as I know a lot of the continuity teams are finding now, as they're, you know, increasing their numbers. We did have some difficulty with some midwives getting a bit burnt out and not managing their I don't want to say they didn't manage to make it work for them, because that makes it sound as if there's some failing on those midwives' part, and I didn't ever feel that was the way. And I think that is sometimes the way it's viewed. It's, if you're not making it work, it's something to do with you, and I don't think that's always the case.
You feel it's more of a lack of support for midwives, for working midwives?
Yeah, so
of the work.
And I think what we had quite a lot as well was we had a lot of newly qualified midwives coming to us. So they were preceptors essentially. And, you know, it's going into a continuity of care was taking up, you know, and very often, because other midwives were leaving, they were often stepping into a full caseload rather than coming in as a new employee and building a caseload. Yeah. So it was just sometimes some of the things were a bit unfortunate, because, you know, people were very keen, especially the newly qualified midwives. They didn't particularly want to work in the sort of the mainstream maternity services, and saw this as a way of really working the way they wanted to work without having to take that step into independent midwifery. But unfortunately, it didn't always work out like that. So and then you know, there were a lot of political issues with one-to-one midwives, and as you probably know, they closed down in 2019, sadly. Yeah, it was a great shame. So I worked, as I say, I worked for them for about a year, and then when I left there, I decided I didn't want to work for anybody else full-time ever again. So I worked for myself since then, trying to think when that was, 2017, something like that. And I trained to do KG hypnobirthing. I became a KG hypnobirthing teacher, which was absolutely an amazing course. I absolutely loved that. It was just so brilliant. And that was where I met Kemi Johnson. She was one of the teachers on that course, and I just thought she was just fantastic. And Nancy Keane was the other teacher, and I'd met Catherine Graves a few years before on another training session as well. And you know, I really thought this was just, you know, such a great course, and you know, it's brilliant for the women as well. Yeah. And the other thing I did, I also trained in a process called the 3-step rewind with a clinical psychologist called Mia Scotland, who at the time was working alongside Alex Heath. They'd kind of teamed up together to provide this training for a variety of people. And it really kind of spoke to me, because I'd experienced rewind myself during my training, during my midwifery training. I also undertook an NLP practitioner's course. So NLP is neuro-linguistic programming, for those who don't know. So it's the study of subjective experience. And doing that, the rewind technique is actually based on an NLP technique. And as I say, I experienced this during my midwifery training, and I found it very powerful in helping me sort out a lot of my issues, particularly around the birth of my first child, because unfortunately what happened was when I'd started my midwifery training, a lot of those issues kind of came back to the surface.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found myself doing was kind of putting my own feelings about my birth experience onto other women and assuming that they would feel that. So I was just kind of over empathizing with people who weren't necessarily even feeling what I'd felt, but I just assumed that they must feel like I did. So that wasn't a very positive state to be in, because you have to meet every woman where she is, and and that's as much as a result of what's just happened as to what's happened in her life up until that point. So that was a great realization for me. So I also do bank shifts occasionally at various local hospitals, but yeah, the focus of my work now is predominantly on working with women who've experienced birth trauma, and I do that in several different ways. So I offer the 3-step rewind program. I also offer private birth afterthoughts or birth debriefing sessions, because sometimes people just need to be heard and listened to by someone who understands and can empathize with them and not judge them. Because there's so many mixed feelings around women and birth trauma. Some women feel very guilty for feeling traumatized, and then there's obviously natural feelings like the huge amounts of sadness and grief that can go along with these negative or traumatic experiences. And it's not always just birth experience. Sometimes it can be really challenging IVF journeys, pregnancies with a lot of sickness or a lot of care that was very lacking in any kind of understanding or sympathy.
I can relate to that.
Women, and one of the overarching things that I find is that women just feel they're not being heard so often, and that if that starts in that pregnancy journey, it's not a great start for that then to go on into that birth and the postnatal period, because if we're not heard, then it definitely impacts the way we feel about ourselves, and it massively dents your self-esteem and your feelings of self-worth, because if you weren't worth listening to, then
it's like a rolling ball, isn't it? You're not listened to and you're not heard, you don't feel empowered, and you don't feel like you can speak up, and you don't know your choices well enough, and sometimes women do just stop listening as well, and you're not listening to me, so I won't listen fully to what's being told. I'll just go back to 3-step rewind. I trained in 3-step rewind last year, or the year before actually, just in December, and it's absolutely incredible. I absolutely loved it, and it's amazing how much of a difference it can make for people.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not appropriate for everybody by any stretch of the imagination, and it's very important that we explore any other sort of issues around that to make sure it is right for you. And for some people, CBT is better, or EMDR or TFT or EFT. There's lots of different trauma modalities out there, but for some people the rewind is a very, very powerful tool. And it is lovely to see people being transformed by it, and it works for lots of different traumas, not just birth trauma as well. I worked with somebody who had experienced a trauma around the incidents around 9/11. And she'd lived with this anxiety, hypervigilance. It impacted her life so badly because she couldn't drive on a motorway, or a dual carriageway. So everywhere she went, she either had to suffer extreme stress and anxiety about being on a motorway or a dual carriageway, or she had to plan a journey where she didn't, avoiding those things. And after the rewind, it was just completely life-changing for her. and it was just magical.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And most of your clients, I guess a lot of your clients now are coming to you because of trauma.
Yeah.
Is there a common theme that you find, particular, trauma that happens over and over again?
So I was thinking about this, and I unfortunately, a large number of the women I talk to have been induced, and have had, long traumatic induction processes. I've had a few women this year who have also had to experience that during COVID, and so they've been very much on their own, not being listened to. I think the not being listened to is probably the biggest thing, I think.
Absolutely.
And the circumstance that, so I can feel the baby saying, "Don't be silly, you're only 2 centimeters," and then going on to have a baby almost in the toilet because they've been told they can't possibly be in labor. I had one labor because she'd only had a pessary, and that couldn't send you into labor. It's like, well, okay. All these various different things, and women being on induction wards and not being fed for 24 hours. They've just got forgotten about, and I'd like to say I'm shocked by some of these things I hear, and sometimes I am, but unfortunately for me, it just reflects my own belief that the maternity system is a little bit broken. I think there's a lot of work going on at the moment to make it better, and I think that's fantastic. I think the Better Births report and the introduction of the continuity of carer teams, the evidence is there. It's an amazing start, and I think some of the girls that are working in that system are finding it so rewarding, and for the women, the feedback is amazing, the feedback that they get, but also the outcomes. You get much better outcomes. You get lower stillbirth numbers, you get much fewer preterm births, more home births, and obviously we know that anyone who books a home birth is are automatically much less likely to have all these interventions and other problems, or end up with a cesarean section or an instrumental birth. I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that cesarean sections or instrumental births are bad or wrong, but
they have their place, don't they? For 100%.
Absolutely, yeah. But it's a long road. We've got a long way to come back from, and I think latest figures suggest that something like 30% of women experience part of their birth or pregnancy journey or postnatal journey as traumatic, and that is a hugely startling figure. If that's 30%, that's nearly 1 in 3. So if you go into a labour ward today and there's 9 women on there, 3 of them are going to feel that part of that process is traumatic, and that's wrong.
It really is. As a doula, I get hired quite a lot for second time babies and third time babies, because unfortunately so many women have had these traumas and they don't want them repeated. And by having a doula or independent midwifery is amazing. And unfortunately, with the insurance issues at the moment, they're not able to work. But the difference that I hear from women who have either had a doula or an independent midwife, which they're not the same thing, very clearly, doulas do not do anything medical whatsoever. We are just there to support the woman. But even that in itself makes such a difference, to have somebody there who can listen and help you on a physical level. And I think it's really sad that it's such a high percentage of women having these traumas or feel trauma from birth, and it should be such an empowering, beautiful moment in a woman's life. To have that amount of trauma there is it's crazy. And I do birth debriefs as the same as you do, and some of the things that we're told is, you know, I get off the phone sometimes and I'm almost in tears listening to these poor women and what they've been through.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of this movement, when push comes to shove, is that we're trying to take it outside of the maternity system, because as a doula, there's not much I can do inside. And Nikita herself is a doula as well. And we found that, you know, we're at the bottom of the heap, which is good. It's fine. That's where we should be. We shouldn't be anywhere higher than that in that sort of sense. But we need to bring birth back outside, back into the community, and educate and inform people of their choices and how they can move forward with an untraumatic birth and have that empowering experience that every woman deserves.
But we definitely need to move doulas higher up the pile. I definitely don't want to be lower down, because again, it's another evidence-based intervention, isn't it, having a doula? And you know, there are some hospitals that actually employ doulas, I know, to support women, and they've had amazing results with them. I think it's Chelsea and Westminster have doulas, don't they?
They do, yeah. But yeah, I don't think that people understand what we're there for, particularly in first births, and so we normally end up coming in the second or third or births after that, once women unfortunately have already had the trauma. And so yeah, it's horrible, really. It really is. And you know, there's a lot of unpicking that we have to do, and yourself being, you know, so involved in the trauma, there's so much unpicking of previous births that we have to go through. And I think when you're not listened to in your birth, you don't feel empowered in your motherhood journey either.
No.
And I see that quite a lot. I do a lot of Reiki and healing, and I see a lot of women coming who feel very unempowered, and a lot of it stems back from birth.
Yeah.
And I had HG with 3 of my pregnancies, but very, very strongly in my 4th and my last pregnancy.
Oh.
I was called a liar, and I was told that it can't be as bad as it was, and these sorts of things. And it's so disempowering and upsetting to not be heard throughout any point of your pregnancy.
There's a terrific lack of understanding around HG, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. There's a wonderful organization called Pregnancy Sickness Support.
Yeah.
I actually peer support for them now, because I think it's so important to have support with HG. It's so unknown. And a lot of terminations we see are actually mothers with HG, because of support, and they're not heard and they're not listened to. Do you have a lot of HG women coming to you for trauma help?
Not so much. No, I have had 1 or 2. A lot of the women that I'm working with currently, I find a lot of women who've had the very traumatic first birth, and they would like to go on to maybe think about having another baby, but at the moment it's just too much for them to even consider because of how things went the first time around. So I'm working a lot with those kind of women that, you know, want to have that option, not necessarily to go on to necessarily have another baby, but they want to have their options back again, because at the moment they just couldn't conceive of the idea of being pregnant or giving birth again, and they can't imagine how they would cope. So yeah, that's the majority. But I've had a few women with hyperemesis and twin pregnancies, all sorts of different things, but you know, everyone has their own story, and yeah, I have a lot of common themes, unfortunately.
Do you find the hypnobirthing, lots of people are very interested and end up having less traumatic births, even if on paper their birth could be considered as traumatic? Do you find that they are less traumatized by having hypnobirthing skills?
I would say so. I think being informed about the realities, I think, is very empowering. But it's like anything with hypnobirthing, you have to practice, you want it to work. It's not just something that you can just go to the classes and that's it, it's going to do everything. you have to practice it, and you have to, you know, you have to believe that you're going to be able to make it work, I suppose. And I think what I remember seeing my very first woman hypnobirthing when I was a newly qualified midwife, and it absolutely blew my mind. She was a first-time mum, and she taught herself hypnobirthing from a book, I believe, or maybe me listening to recordings. It was listening to recordings, because they played this track over and over again in the background in the birthing room, and she just sat very quietly through the whole labour, and she didn't make a sound. And then she knew when it was time for baby to come, and she just moved herself to sit on a little birthing stool that we had in the room, and she just breathed her baby out.
Wow.
No gas and air, no nothing, and just with her partner whispering affirmations in her ear the whole time. And it just was so beautiful. And I was just felt so grateful and so privileged to have been there and witnessed that. It was just amazing. And that was part of the reason why I did the training myself, was because, you know, I wanted to be able to help women in that way. And you know, it's been around for a very long time, hypnobirthing. It's just that, you know, people haven't necessarily used it. But I think we're learning more about the power of our minds, and I think this is why, you know, Rewind for me is so great, because it's such a simple process, but it's very powerful. But because it uses the power of our own minds to kind of unpick the way that, I mean, our brains are trying to protect us and keep us safe, which is why we feel triggered. You know, we something happens and we're sent into a panic, or, you know, those same feelings that we had when we were panicked during perhaps a birth experience or any other experience. And our minds just get stuck in there, and we need to be able to tell them that we're safe again. And because normally that's what will happen. You know, if you got attacked by a bear, for example, you'd feel very frightened and you'd run away or you'd fight or whatever. But you know, if for whatever reason you couldn't fight or run away, then, you know, that might get your brain stuck in that feeling. So you might continue to feel continuously anxious and afraid, which is completely exhausting as well. Leave you feeling completely overwhelmed. So unhooking those negative feelings from a memory, we can help people move forward again without all that emotional baggage kind of thing.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for all of your work that you do, and we will post your links in the comments for your website. And
no, thank you.
And it's absolutely amazing to sit and talk with you, and we could probably talk for hours about all of it. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for everything that you do for birthing women all across the country.
Thank you, and the same for you.